Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. Today's story carries a message that may just change how you see your own life. Let me start with a question. Have you ever felt like time is running out for you? Maybe you've looked at your dreams, your goals, or even your relationships and thought, it's too late. My chance is gone. If you've ever carried that weight on your heart, then stay with me, because this story is for you. The title is simple, yet it holds something eternal. Heaven has never put an expiration date on you. The night our story begins, the sky was heavy with clouds, almost as if it was holding its breath. In a small, quiet town, a man named Daniel sat alone on a park bench. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from years of disappointment. Daniel was the kind of person who had given his best to life, but felt life had quietly slipped away from him. His dreams of becoming an artist had been buried under years of bills, jobs, and responsibilities. The world had convinced him he was too old, too late, and too far gone. But here's the truth. Heaven doesn't work by the world's calendar. While people mark deadlines, heaven marks possibilities. And on that night, something unexpected happened. As Daniel sat beneath the dim streetlight, he heard the faint sound of music. It wasn't coming from a phone or a passing car. It was softer, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. He turned his head and saw a young woman, standing with an old violin in her hands. She played with her eyes closed, as if she was pouring her entire soul into the strings. The song was haunting, yet beautiful, like it was telling his story without words. Drawn to her, Daniel listened, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. A spark, a reminder that he was still alive. But just as quickly as the music began, it stopped. The woman lowered her violin and looked directly at him, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Do you know," she said softly, "that heaven never puts an expiration date on you?" Those words hit him harder than anything he had ever heard. They weren't just words, they were a message, meant for him. But before he could ask who she was, or how she knew what he was feeling, the wind picked up, and the streetlight flickered. When he looked back, she was gone. The bench, the violin, the music, all of it had vanished into the night. Daniel was left trembling, staring into the shadows, wondering if he had just seen an angel, or if his life was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. And that's where our story truly begins. Daniel sat frozen on that old wooden bench, staring at the empty space where the woman had just been. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of wonder and confusion. He rubbed his eyes as if that would somehow bring her back, but the park was silent again. Only the rustling of the trees and the faint hum of distant traffic reminded him he was still grounded in reality. Yet something inside him whispered that what had happened wasn't a dream. It was too real, too precise, too perfectly timed. He leaned back and closed his eyes, replaying her words over and over. Heaven never puts an expiration date on you. Those words cut through the years of bitterness he had quietly carried. For so long, Daniel had measured his life by missed chances. He thought of the job he lost in his 20s, the painting career he never pursued, the friendships he let fade. Every memory felt like a closed door, sealed shut by time. But now, one sentence from a stranger, or perhaps something more than a stranger, had shaken the foundations of his story. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he noticed something on the ground beneath the streetlight. A single sheet of old music paper fluttered in the wind. He bent down to pick it up. The notes on the page were faded, but there at the top were words written in elegant handwriting. A song without an ending. He held the paper tightly, not knowing why, but feeling as though it belonged to him now. The mystery only deepened. That night, back in his small apartment, Daniel couldn't sleep. The city outside his window moved on with its usual rhythm. Cars, footsteps, voices, but inside his room, the world felt altered. He pulled out his old sketchbook from the bottom drawer of his desk, a book he hadn't opened in nearly 15 years. Dust clung to the cover. When he flipped it open, the pages were filled with half-finished drawings, abandoned visions of a man who once believed in himself. He wondered if the woman's words were meant to awaken this forgotten part of him. But the question that wouldn't leave his mind was, who was she? Was she simply a musician who happened to be in the right place at the right time? Or was she a messenger, someone sent to remind him that life is not measured by deadlines, that heaven's timing is different from ours? Daniel stared at the sheet of music on his desk, the words echoing through his heart, a song without an ending. Could it be a sign that his own story wasn't finished? Just as that thought took hold, the wind outside his window howled, rattling the glass. The same haunting melody from the park seemed to rise in the night air, faint but undeniable, pulling him toward something he could not yet see. Daniel pressed his hands against the window, straining to hear the faint melody drifting through the night. It was the same tune from the park, carrying that same ache of beauty and mystery. He stepped back, his chest tightening with a question he couldn't shake. Why him? Why now? For years he had convinced himself that his time had passed, that purpose was something reserved for the younger, the braver, the luckier. And yet here it was, chasing him in the form of a song without an ending. The conflict grew louder in his mind. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as imagination, a trick of exhaustion. But another part, the part that remembered his boyhood dreams of painting, of creating something that outlived him, whispered that this was no accident. What terrified him most wasn't the thought of being mistaken. It was the thought of believing again, of opening his heart to hope and risking another disappointment. As he wrestled with these thoughts, his phone buzzed with a message from his sister Claire. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, frustrated with how often he shut himself away. Her words were simple. "We're worried about you. Don't disappear again." Daniel's guilt stirred. Claire had always believed in him, even when he couldn't. But how could he explain to her the strange encounter, the music, the words that refused to let him go? Meanwhile, miles away, the woman with the violin stood at the edge of a quiet riverbank, staring at the reflection of the moon. She had left the park for a reason Daniel did not yet know. Her path was tangled with his, bound by something greater than coincidence. And while Daniel battled doubt in his apartment, she whispered into the night, "He hasn't seen it yet, but he will." Daniel couldn't shake the sound of that melody. Night after night it returned, sometimes faint like a whisper through the walls, sometimes sharp and clear, as if someone were playing right outside his door. He stopped sleeping, his sketchbook now spread open across the table, filled with frantic sketches, faces he didn't recognize, landscapes that seemed pulled from dreams, and always a violin in the center. The conflict inside him grew unbearable. He wanted answers, but he was afraid of what he might find if he followed the call. One evening, just before midnight, Daniel finally gave in. He grabbed the sheet of music and left his apartment, following the sound that seemed to draw him deeper into the city. The streets were empty, but he felt guided, as though unseen hands were pulling him forward. Every turn led him closer to the melody, until he reached an abandoned church at the edge of town. Its doors hung crooked on their hinges, the stained glass cracked and covered with dust. Yet from inside, the song poured out with a force that made his chest ache. Daniel stepped cautiously through the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. The church was dark except for a single candle flickering at the altar. And there she was, the woman with the violin. Her eyes were closed, her bow gliding across the strings, filling the hollow space with notes that felt like both a warning and an invitation. He froze, torn between running and stepping closer. She opened her eyes, locking onto his, as if she had been waiting for him all along. The music stopped, and silence wrapped around them like a storm about to break. Daniel clutched the sheet of music in his hand, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Daniel's breath caught as the woman lowered her violin, her eyes never leaving his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the old church felt heavier than the music had, as though the walls themselves were waiting for what would happen next. Then, slowly, she pointed at the sheet of music clutched in his trembling hand. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," she whispered. Her voice carried a strange mix of sorrow and urgency, and it struck Daniel like a warning. He stared at her, confusion thick in his chest. "What do you mean? It was there, under the light. I thought it was meant for me." Her expression darkened, and she stepped forward, the candlelight flickering across her face. "It is meant for you, but not like this. That song is unfinished, and only you can complete it. But if you fail—" She let the words trail off, leaving the air thick with unanswered questions. Daniel's pulse quickened. The conflict he had been carrying, the fear of hope, the battle between giving up and trying again, suddenly felt much larger than his own life. He sensed that this wasn't just about his forgotten dreams of painting or the years he had wasted. This was about something higher, something tied to purpose, destiny, and timing. Then came the twist that froze him where he stood. She lifted her violin again and played a short, piercing phrase. To his shock, Daniel recognized it. Not from the park, not from the church, but from his own childhood. It was a tune his mother used to hum while she worked at the kitchen table, long before illness took her away. His chest tightened as memories surged back, sharp and overwhelming. How could this stranger know that song? He hadn't heard it in decades, hadn't even thought about it. And yet, here she was, playing it note for note, as if she had been there all along. Daniel staggered back a step, his voice unsteady. How do you know that?" She lowered her bow, her gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "Because your story was written long before you ever gave up on it. Heaven hasn't forgotten you, Daniel, but you're not the only one in danger of losing your song." Her words sent a chill through him. If the expiration date he feared was never meant for him, then who or what was truly running out of time? The candle flickered wildly, shadows bending against the walls as though the church itself was bracing for the answer. Daniel stood frozen in the church, his heart pounding like a drum. The woman's words echoed through him, each one peeling back the layers of doubt he had wrapped around himself for years. Not the only one in danger of losing your song. He realized now that this was bigger than his personal failures. His silence, his surrender, his decision to bury his gifts. Those choices had rippled outward. What he thought was just a private struggle had left others waiting in the dark for a song that only he could bring. The woman stepped closer, placing the violin gently into his hands. "Play," she said softly, though her eyes burned with urgency. Daniel shook his head, fear clawing at him. He hadn't touched an instrument in decades, and besides, the violin wasn't his art. He was a painter, not a musician. But before he could protest, she whispered, "It doesn't matter. The music is inside you. Just let it out." Hands trembling, Daniel lifted the bow. At first the sound was rough, uneven, like the voice of a man long silent. But then something shifted. His memories, his grief, his lost dreams, all poured out into the strings. The church walls seemed to hum, the candle's flame growing brighter as the unfinished melody filled the room. And as he played, he saw flashes in his mind. His mother's smile, Claire's patient love, the countless people whose lives he had touched without realizing. Each note was a thread, weaving back together the pieces of a life he thought was wasted. The woman closed her eyes, tears streaking her cheeks as the song swelled to its peak. Daniel felt the weight of his conflict lift. It wasn't too late. heaven had never marked him as finished. His expiration date had never existed. The song was proof. But then, just as the final note rang out, the candle abruptly died. Darkness swallowed the church. Daniel's breath caught. He reached out blindly, but the violin was gone. The woman was gone. Only silence remained. When the first light of dawn crept through the broken stained glass, Daniel stood alone at the altar, the sheet of music still in his hand. He looked down and saw that new notes had appeared on the page. Notes he hadn't written. And at the bottom, in the same elegant script, was a message. This was never only your song. Someone else is still waiting to hear it. Daniel's heart raced. The conflict was resolved within him, but the twist was undeniable. His journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Daniel stood in the quiet church as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the cracked floor. The message at the bottom of the music sheet lingered in his mind. This was never only your song. Someone else is still waiting to hear it. For the first time in years, he didn't feel weighed down by regret. Instead, he felt a sense of direction, as though heaven itself had placed a compass in his hand. The expiration date he thought had sealed his fate was nothing more than a lie he had carried too long. When he stepped outside, the world looked different. The same streets, the same buildings, the same ordinary morning, but his eyes saw it all with fresh light. He walked home with the sheet of music clutched tightly, already knowing what he had to do. His story wasn't meant to end in silence. It was meant to be shared, to remind others that no matter how far gone they feel, their purpose still breathes. Daniel began painting again. At first the lines were shaky, but soon the colors poured out of him as if they had been waiting all along. He painted the violin, the church, the candle, his mother's smile. Each canvas told a story of hope, second chances, and the truth that heaven never puts an expiration date on anyone. He also reached out to Claire, finally opening up about the struggles he had hidden. To his surprise, she didn't judge him. She cried, hugged him, and simply said, "I knew you weren't finished yet." Weeks later, Daniel displayed his work at a small community gallery. As people stopped to look at his paintings, he watched their expressions soften, their eyes linger. One woman whispered, "It feels like this was painted for me." In that moment, Daniel understood the final twist of the message. His gift was never just for himself. His song, his art, was meant to awaken others, to remind them that it is never too late to begin again. As the evening closed, Daniel stood by his favorite piece, a painting of a violin glowing in the light of dawn. He thought of the mysterious woman and the unfinished song. Though she never appeared again, he carried her words in every brushstroke. Heaven had spoken through music, memory, and mystery, but the lesson was clear. No life is beyond redemption, no dream beyond reach. And for Daniel, and for anyone willing to believe, the truth remained. There is no expiration date on the human soul.